on camera.
Today is November 4th, 2016. My name is Tony Hilliard. I'm here at the Atlanta History Center with Mr. Ed Woods and Sue Verhoff, who is the Director of Oral History at the Atlanta History Center. We're here today to interview Mr. Ron Thomas. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience while serving in the U.S. Air Force. Mr. Thomas, can you give us your, just tell us where you live and when you were born, and then we'll just talk a little bit about your early years.
I was born December 20th, 1941 in Youngstown, Ohio, which is a mill town in northeast Ohio. And today it's considered part of the Rust Belt, but at the time in the 40s and 50s when I was growing up, it was a very prosperous town, a blue-collar town. My family, relatives were all blue-collar people who worked in the steel mills. And I've always felt that where you grow up and the things that you experience, say, prior to the age of 21, have a big impact on what you do as an adult. And in Youngstown, for being a mill town, it had a lot of great things, like a public library that was outstanding. And in third grade, I discovered the public library and became a lifelong reader of books, thanks to the Youngstown Public Library. One of the other things that I think had a big influence on me growing up in Youngstown was discovering amateur radio. And in the 7th grade, I got an amateur radio license, took a lifelong interest in radio and electronics, which ultimately led at the age of 16, which people sort of find hard to believe. Just through using library books, I took an 8-hour exam with the Federal Communications Commission and became licensed as a commercial radio operator. And between my junior year and senior year of high school, got a job running a transmitter site for a commercial radio station. I filled in the summertime for people on vacation and worked part-time in the winter, all through the senior year of high school and 4 years of college. And these kinds of things, I think, have a tremendous experience for you because you get to work with adults, you get to understand the world of work, the world of adults. And I'll say this for the people in Youngstown, they had a lot of faith in young people in those days. I mean, to let a 16-year-old kid run a transmitter site by himself for a commercial radio station says a lot about what people were willing to let you do in those days. One of the other things that I think had a tremendous influence on me growing up in Youngstown was learning to fly an airplane, which I did in college. And things were much more affordable in those days. I paid for my college tuition, books, and my parents got me a used car to drive and fed me, but I still had money to take flying lessons. You couldn't do any of that today. And I think learning to fly a plane was another thing that had a tremendous impact. You learned self-reliance, you learned to be responsible, you learned that your decisions, good or bad, can make or break you. The other thing that had an influence on me was growing up in the 50s. That was the age of the Cold War, the atomic bomb. It was also the age of the space race, Sputnik. And I think we've sort of forgotten how terrified we were in America when the Russians put that little satellite up that all it did was go beep, beep, beep. But we were really afraid of it. It was the age of military draft, the 50s and 60s. And people today sort of don't realize that not only did they draft average people, they drafted doctors and dentists. People today find this hard to believe, but it was a different era. Growing up in the 50s and into the 60s, I knew people who had served in the military. My father, several of my uncles were exempt because they worked in a steel mill and they wanted them in the mill more than they wanted them in the Army. But I had an uncle by marriage who was a combat engineer in the Pacific, who saw hard duty in the Pacific. I had another uncle who was an airplane mechanic in the Pacific, which was obviously much safer. I worked with a fellow who flew on the Ploiesti raid as a radio operator, lost parts of some fingers from flak. Had a very good friend who was on the third wave at Normandy, Graves registration. He buried the Germans. He marched across Germany, his outfit, buried the Germans. He said, "We did for the Germans what we did for the Americans. We treated them just as respectfully. What we found, we buried. We kept track, did the paperwork." And one of the finest human beings I've ever met. I mean, the man made tremendous sacrifices along with everyone else in his outfit. I had another friend, he was a Signal Corps officer in the Pacific. He was the only officer I knew. So basically, the people I knew were enlisted people. He was the only officer. And obviously, knowing him impacted my thinking about possibly wanting to be an officer in the military. And the last but not least, I had a grandfather who was a prisoner of war of the Japanese, but not in World War II, in the Japanese-Russian War of 1904. He spoke very little English, and before the man died, I would have been in junior high school, I managed to talk to him to find out how he got, to this country and that he was a prisoner of war. No one in the family ever asked the man anything, which is pretty sad if you think about it. How did the man get from Siberia, a peasant, to Yonkers, New York, by way of South America, And he tried to explain to me about being a soldier and how he got to this country and how he ended up in Youngstown, Ohio. Now, I graduated from high school in 1959, and the fall of '59, when I turned 18, I had to register for the draft. But at that point, I was in college, got college deferments, and really was not thinking much about the military. I'm in college, I'm working, I'm going to school, I'm taking flying lessons, and in the back of my mind, I know the draft. And people today don't understand, with the draft, you had a 6-year obligation. And typically, if you got drafted, you served 2, active 2. But there were all kinds of combinations and arrangements. And several friends graduated from high school and didn't go to college, enlisted. And so I'm just sort of dilly-dallying, thinking, oh, you have to do something. Maybe I'll go in the Air Force Reserves. And late in the spring of '62, which would have been my junior year, in the main administrative building, walking down the hallway, there are 3 desks. And there's the recruiters, which I'd never seen before. And the first desk is the Army guys. And I thought, nah, we had Army ROTC. I was sleeping tents. Nah, not for me. The next desk is the Navy guy. And I'm looking and I thought, they want line officers to drive ships. I don't think I'd drive, And the third one was the Air Force recruiter. And I looked at that and I thought, I could probably do this. So, we talked to the recruiter and he said, come by and blah, 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 blah. Okay. And so I go, and a week or so went down, saw him, and he said, well, you need to take the test. Oh, okay. So that summer I go to Akron, Ohio, take a 4-hour exam. And I don't hear from this recruiter. I thought, what's going on? School starts, I go to look up the recruiter. Oh yeah, he did well. I thought, this guy is not really hustling here. And he said, you need to take the physical. Okay. So he schedules to go to Cleveland in the fall, and I go to Cleveland to take the physical. And he asked me to take some football player from Youngstown University with me. So we go, we spend the day. The football player flunks the physical. He's got bad knees. And I'm some skinny little intellectual, and I'm 1A. Okay. So again, I don't hear from the Air Force recruiter. And then I go back. Oh, yeah. He's putting the paperwork together, he tells me. All right. I check some more. So finally, I guess late in the fall of '62, he says, it's all been submitted, and you'll hear from the Air Force after the first of the year. So I said, okay, I'll wait. And sure enough, probably the end of January of '63, it was a cold winter's day, there's snow on the ground, probably a Saturday because I was out shoveling snow off the porch. The mailman gives me this letter from the Air Force and says, I've been accepted into the officer training school. And they would send me to electronics school for 43 weeks. And if I want to do this, just sign this piece of paper and they'll hold a place for me. Now, obviously, I wasn't legally committed, but they're trying to get a sense of who wants to do this and who really is not interested. So I sign up, and okay, so I can stop looking for a job because I'm going in the Air Force. And it would have been the end of May of '63. I graduated from college, and by that point I got a pilot's license and I'm going in the Air Force. And the last week of June, I go to Cleveland, take yet another physical, and they swear me in, and I go home. this is what I always thought was hilarious. There's 50 draftees or guys that enlisted. They're all putting them on buses, and there were 4 or 5 of us going to OTS, and they take us aside and say, well, you have a week to go to Texas. You can fly, drive, take your car. So I give you a set of orders. I go home that night, and I sleep in my own bed. And my parents say, well, we thought you were in the Air Force. Well, I am, you know. So the next day, I woke up and, you know, packed the car and said goodbye to my parents. And I'd been pretty much on my own in college between working and school. And so there was no tearful farewells or anything. It was just, okay, he's going in the Air Force. And I started driving, and probably 4 hours later, I got to Columbus, Ohio, had lunch and started going west. And that's for the first time where I realized that my life had changed. For whatever reason, at that moment, I realized I was never going back to Youngstown. I was going into a different world, a white-collar world. I was leaving the blue-collar world, although in truth, I think it's always part of you, but I was going into a different world. And so for the next 4 or 5 days, I drove to Texas and got there on a Saturday morning, and then Monday morning you go and you sign in, and the harassment begins. Although, the truth be told, I mean, this is not like being in the Marine Corps, let's face it. I mean, this is the Air Force, you know. I mean, so nobody screams. It's just harassment, you know. White-collar inspections and just jerking you around, for lack of a better expression. And then there were some people that just found it too much early on, dropped out. But, you know, this was just not that bad. But the interesting thing was I enlisted for 2 years as an Airman Basic. And if I had not completed officer school, or they washed me out, or I quit, I owed 2 years as an enlisted man. It had been 6 months, but I think too many people were giving up too quick. So they said, here's an incentive not to give up 2 years, you know, so okay. But I'd been there, the first day I got there, they made me a staff sergeant for pay purposes. I mean, you know, okay, it's more money, that's good. They let me take a car there. This is obviously not the Marine Corps. And you know, you just start the routine of what you have to do. We went to school academically half day, march and drill the other half. It was hot. I mean, it was, people were swallowing salt tablets like there was no tomorrow. And it was just, that heat and no sleep. I lost 20 pounds in 3 months. I went from 140 pounds to 120. I mean, and they just ran you ragged. I mean, I saw people pass out on the drill field, and they just cart them off. We were young and healthy. It was hard to kill anybody, literally. I mean, they'd take them, dump them in cold water. And the other thing I remember is getting immunization shots. They did it with a gun. They had an assembly line, and they had a gun, and they shot you. They've long since stopped that because they found it was a health hazard. And people would pass out, you just step over. Nobody, I mean, it just, I mean, in retrospect, it was just sort of funny in a way. The hardest thing for me was probably learning how to march and drill, because I'd never done that before. And the drill manual's 150 pages. And when you see parades, this looks easy. Well, the first thing, you have to learn how to do it as an individual, to march, follow, you know. Secondly, you have to learn how to be the one giving the directions. And you got 50 people out there and maybe 2 groups of 50. It's a challenge. I saw march people in the walls, fences, you name it, and people did it. And much to my amazement, I finally caught on to it and did fairly well at it. But it was just long, tiring. I mean, the heat was just, the heat index some afternoon, they wouldn't let us go outside. A couple of the interesting things that I thought from officer school, got thinking about it. The one that I thought was the most amusing was the day they were going to have us shoot the gun. They put us in a gymnasium, some auditorium, and some sergeant from the pistol range is there. And there's, I guess, 100 of us in our squadron. And he's up there explaining about the gun. It's a .38 revolver. This is, talk about an officer's weapon. And the hit, you could tell the thing he was most concerned about was somebody shooting somebody with the gun, an accident on the range. So and college boys with guns. So he went over it and over it, and okay. They load us on buses, take us down there, and I mean, this is deadly serious. It's a huge firing range, big red flags, and they line you up, and I mean, it's by the numbers. And the big thing was, I remember, if the gun jams, keep the gun pointed at the target. Do not point the gun at anyone. And I guess we all got through, because I don't know, just shot the gun, and okay, we're done with that, and go back. But the direct opposite of that was, at some point they ran us through the, quote, confidence course. And this was one of these deals where you had to crawl under barbed wire, and they set off landmines and stuff. Now, I guess you could have broken an arm or a leg. I don't think you could have gotten killed on that thing. I mean, the Army, the Marines had live fire confidence courses with machine gun fire, where at the end, if you stood up, you got killed. So this was stressful, but I don't think it was that stressful. But it was dirty. I mean, we finished that thing, we were just covered with dirt. And so they loaded us on the bus. They probably had to hose the bus out. And they took us back to the barracks and said, take a shower, get cleaned up, put all those clothes in these laundry bags. We're taking you to the base laundry. You'll pay to have everything cleaned, because you can't clean it. Because we had gone through tear gas and, we were just a mess. But it was an interesting experience. It wasn't, like I say, it's the Air Force. It was, this isn't the Marines. And I was realistic about the whole thing. The other thing was that it was a well-run program. People had to meet certain standards to get through, and some people quit. Some people just gave up too quick, But basically, there were probably 1,000 of us that got commissioned in one morning. They were, at that point, gearing up to crank out lieutenants like there was no tomorrow. And so, well, another funny thing that I didn't understand at the time, but I understand now, Monday night, we're finished. Tuesday morning, we get sworn in, and the training captain, he's giving us this talk about making sure we're there to get sworn in. I'm like, where are we going to go, This makes no sense. I finally realized, after looking years after the fact at discharge papers and stuff, they had to discharge us from the Air Force at midnight on Monday night. And so until 8 o'clock the next morning, we were civilians. And apparently somebody had gone home on them. And they were not amused. They just, I guess, turned it over to the draft board, and that person was in the Army. Well, we couldn't fathom, why would you not be there? Where are we going to go? But we'd turn up, Tuesday morning, and they probably had groups of 100 of us. And it took several hours even then. And at one point, I guess 2/3 of the way through the program, I was within striking distance of being offered a regular commission, which kind of amazed the training officer. He didn't think I was all that military, which I wasn't. But I could do this stuff. So it's hard to argue if you can do it, even if you don't look like you could do it. So he had to counsel me about taking a regular commission while he's shaking his head and kind of laughing. But at the end, it was top 10%. I might have been in the top third, not the top. And I didn't want a regular commission. I just reserve officer, 4 years, go home. And so we went, and somebody's wife pinned my bars on me, and we were sworn in the Air Force, and it was over. And surrounding the parade ground were all these enlisted people. And they were standing there because there's a tradition that the first enlisted person you salute as an officer, you have to give them $1. So there were people there with wads of money, and I thought, this is great, all these lieutenants. At OTS, Officers Training School, I remember the only thing we ever did more than once, 3 times we were there, probably every month for 3 months, they showed us a film called The Third Challenge. It was a movie about counterinsurgency. And I realize now it was Vietnam. But we didn't know that. We didn't understand, we just, okay, what is this? It's the only thing we've ever done 3 times. And so we're finished, we're commissioned. And at that point, you're going to go to wherever you're going to go, tech school or where. Well, most everybody went home on leave, so I got my little Volkswagen Beetle and drove 1,500 miles back to Youngstown, and saw my parents who had moved. It was sort of funny. They moved from out to the suburbs further, but I told them I'd find them, and I did, and they laughed. But there was nothing there, so a week I'm bored. I went back to Texas, and I'm in a gymnasium with 50, 60 lieutenants who are waiting to go to tech schools. And they're backed up and everything, and you can't do nothing. Nobody can do nothing. Somebody's got to be busy. So they're asking us who can type. And these lieutenants are waving their hands, and I thought, they ain't taking a survey, fellas, They're going to make typists out of you. So I'm, can't type, So they got down to a couple of us who said, we have no useful skills. I thought, it's got to be better than typing. So they take me aside, introduced me to this lieutenant colonel, and he said, you're going to air police school for a couple months. I said, what will I be doing? You'll be critiquing the curriculum. I thought, oh, okay, what's that involved? What that meant was I sat in a class with enlisted guys who were going to be air policemen from 6 to 12. Just sat there and watched them learn how to be air policemen. And finally, after the first week, the sergeants teaching the class took me aside, and they're apologizing, buying me coffee. And I said, what are you apologizing for? They said, we thought you were a spy. We found out you're just here. I said, yeah. I said, is there anything I can do to help you? They said, well, let us give you information about what we want to see happen to improve the course. And I said, sure, if it sounds good, I'll turn it in. So every Friday I wrote something up, turned it in, and they were thrilled. But finally, after 2 months, I was just bored. I just want to leave. So you just got to know in the military, everything's got regulations. You just got to read them close. And so I realized the tech school said, if I thought I needed the math refresher course, I could go 2 weeks early. I thought, yeah, I need that math refresher. I'm going to leave here. So I'm base personnel. They're happy to get rid of me, no problem. So I go to Biloxi, Mississippi 2 weeks early, and several other people showed up there. They'd done the same thing. And they give us this math refresher course and decide, you don't need this. Well, we're here now, too late. So they said, we'll give you an instructor for 3 or 4 days. He'll teach you direct current. If you can pass the exam, we'll wash you ahead to a class that's already in existence. Otherwise, we'll start a new class. Okay. Well, I knew enough electronics that I could pass this, and oddly enough, or interestingly enough, they washed me ahead into a class. The class leader was a fellow I'd gone through officer school with. And so I joined that class, and we went to school together and through it. And the fellow who was the class leader, he did quite well for himself. He eventually ended up a one-star general in the California National Guard. A sharp fellow. But electronics school was one of the best schools I'd ever gone to in my entire life. The military, or at least the Air Force, could teach anybody to do anything, literally. 80% of the people in electronics school had liberal arts degrees. My best friend was an art history major from the University of Wisconsin. Never flunked, if you would study and listen, you could do it. We went from class to 6 in the morning till 12 noon. Every 10 minutes you had a break, half hour or a 20-minute break halfway through. Get coffee, and then you were on your own. You typically had 2 hours worth of homework. Now some people, it took them more. And you were getting paid to sit in class. That was your job, to go to class. You were supposed to help out at some. The enlisted people had to march to class and all. We got to drive. You were on your own. Just show up and do it. And just great teachers, great instructors. The only difference probably between that and being in college was the first session of each day for class, the class leader called the room to attention. So you stood up, and then they just set seats, and you sat down, and you were a student. And they just started with electricity, vacuum tubes. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I was a ham radio, electronics, and most of the people there, even if they had no background in electronics, found it interesting. And people would say, well, what was their motivation if they weren't interested? I said, there's worse places in Biloxi, Mississippi, folks. You could be a Minuteman launch officer and mine at North Dakota. They could find places you won't like. So people studied. I never knew anyone who flunked out or quit, or you just did it. Halfway through, we switched from 12 to 6. because we were then studying equipment, telephone equipment, radio equipment, and they just changed the schedule. It was just a very well-run program. Like I said, 80% were liberal arts grads, 10% might have had hard science degrees, math, physics, 10% engineering. We had one engineer in our class. And the instructors were mostly lieutenants. We did have some civilian instructors. And they all did a great job. I mean, just can't say enough good things. Biloxi's a pleasant place to be, obviously. You know, you had weekends off. All you had to do was pass the test. And really nothing, that was your job, to go to school, to be a student. And nobody harassed you or anything. It was a nice BOQ we lived in, air conditioned. You couldn't complain about this, you know. When we were finishing up, about 2 months before the end of the course, which would have been the fall of '64, you got an assignment to a specific command, Air Force command. And so the list would come down and it'd have names on them, and my name appeared for Logistics Command. Supply, I thought, no, that's all, what am I going to... So I thought, I'm going to end up in Tinker Air Force Base, where it's a big logistics base or something, as the base comm person. And then suddenly the next month it comes down, I'm going to be assigned to something called the Ground Electronics Engineering Installation Agency Squadron, commonly known as GEEIA, G-E-E-I-A, at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, with a duty assignment at Cape Canaveral. Well, oddly enough, there had been a big article about that squadron in the Air Force Times. Oh, I thought, okay, read that. This looks really interesting, and this looks like a decent assignment. Oh, I should mention that the people in my class that had those hard science engineering degrees, they all pretty much stayed behind as instructors because they were going to add an evening shift from 6 to 12. And since I'd studied economics in college, they let me leave, which was fine with me. And most of the guys that stayed as instructors, they weren't unhappy with that. The ones that were married, their wives were working, and they weren't complaining. So they were cranking up at that point. I mean, adding a third shift and cranking out more people. GEEIA was an organization established in the Air Force about 1960 to do major installation of electronics equipment and depot maintenance of that equipment throughout the Air Force. So they had a vast number of GEEIA squadrons all over the world. And the one that was, so they did things like telephone systems, antennas, high frequency, you name it, radar, electronics. We were trained as electronics officers with a specialty in communications equipment and systems. There were a few officers who were trained strictly in radar, which was very unusual. When I was going through, they were training no computer maintenance people. They had at some point. So GEEIA was an interesting assignment because most people got assigned to base communications outfits. So GEEIA was a different assignment. Let me explain a little something about Patrick, Cape Canaveral, and all that, because people tend to get this all confused and think it's one and the same, which it isn't. If you look at a map of Florida, where Florida juts out, Cape Canaveral, that's 15,000 acres, and that's a launch site. They built it around 1950 when they decided they needed to move missile launch test operations from White Sands, which was in New Mexico, and El Paso, because in the late 40s, we were launching V-2 rockets that the Germans had built. We brought the Germans over, Werner von Braun, and bought 100 V-2s, and we were sending up, we really were. It was scientific stuff, looking at the atmosphere. And one of those things, instead of going north, it went south into Mexico, and the government of Mexico was not amused. Made a big hole in the ground. I mean, it wasn't no warhead, it was just a big thing that hit. So they ended up moving to Cape Canaveral. It was nothing. They had to create a facility there. It was just Florida swampland. And 15,000 acres, and by the time I got there in the 60s, it had 10,000 people, mostly civilians that worked on the Cape. In addition, there was the Air Force Eastern Test Range, which went from Cape Canaveral downrange to Ascension Island in the South Atlantic Ocean, south of the equator. And in a little bit, I'll talk more about Ascension. They built tracking sites at the Grand Bahama Islands, Trinidad, Eleuthera, Ascension. And it was a big, big operation. Patrick was a support base. It was a typical Air Force base. In World War II and at the late 40s, it had been the Banana River Naval Air Station. They never tore it down because they thought they'd have a use for it, and they did. They turned it into Patrick. So we lived in a BOQ there. There was a hospital, runways, the support aircraft. It was a big base, civilian base. In the 1960s, Pan American World Airways had the contract to manage the Cape and the Air Force Eastern Test Range. It meant they managed all the facilities, the complexes. They subcontracted with RCA, Radio Corporation of America, to manage communications equipment. And GEEIA was tasked with doing installation and depot level maintenance of all that equipment on the Cape and on the range. And when you think in the 60s of Cape Canaveral, you think of the manned space program. When I was there, the Gemini two-man space program in the 65, 66 was very active. But truth be told, that was really a small part of what went on there. There were tremendous numbers of missile launches related to testing missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, Atlas, Titan. There were submarine launches that went downrange from there. So it was a busy, busy place, a lot of which people were unaware of what was going on. They were also launching a lot of communications satellites from Cape Canaveral. The spy stuff typically goes from Vandenberg in California. Most of the stuff that went out of the Cape was unclassified, weather types of things, communications. So GEEIA support on the Cape was extensive because there was all that equipment, high-frequency transmitters, antennas. There was probably 1,000 miles of cable on there. And this was long before you had fiber optics and all this fancy electronic stuff. It was what today looks like old technology. To the west of Cape Canaveral, across the Banana River, NASA built what we commonly think of as the moon port. That was where they built the launch complex to send the Saturn V to go to the moon. They also built, what I saw them build, the vertical assembly building, which at the time was the largest building in the world in terms of volume. Supposedly you could make it rain inside the building. And then they had the crawler, which would take that huge Saturn V, would crawl down the road to the launch complex. But that was NASA. That was a separate facility. Although for some of the initial types of things, the launches were actually done from the Cape in support of NASA. So there was a lot of interaction between military, civilian, and NASA and the Air Force and what have you. The first job that I had when I got with the GEEIA Squadron, I liked electronics. I wanted to be the electronics guy. And instead they gave me the outside plant people, which, that figures. So I had construction people, cable splicers, the people that did the telephone systems. And it was good in the sense that it was a world I really knew nothing about. And in those days, like I say, there was no fiber optics cable. We had typically 1,800 pair lead-covered telephone cables. And what we would do, our people, they would pull between manholes this lead-covered cable. And from the second manhole, you'd pull cable to the third manhole. And in the second manhole, two airmen would go down there and they'd spend the day splicing wires, two wires at a time until you'd spliced and soldered 3,600 wires. And then you put a lead-covered splice case on it, and then you poured, you can't make this up, you poured hot lead to seal it. How no one ever got hurt amazes me. We never had anyone get hurt. You'd think, I guess breathing lead fumes wasn't good for you, but in terms of pouring hot lead, no one ever got hurt. I have no idea how. We also maintained the telephone exchange on the Cape. There was a lot of closed-circuit television, which had its own cable stuff. We put all that cable under pressurization to keep water out of it. And it was a really big operation. I mean, and of course, the people working for me were all pretty big guys. I mean, with construction and one thing or another. And
can I ask you a question?
Yes.
When you said pressurize, did you have a sleeve or a pipe or something that you put the cable
into
in?
the cable, there were places where they could put nitrogen into it and put the whole cable under pressure, and there was a central point where they fed it, could monitor it. If there was a leak, they would know that there was a leak about where it was, and they can go and find a leak and fix it.
So the pressure was actually cableized.
The cable was pressurized, so water couldn't get into
it. It wasn't that the cable was in another...
Nope.
Okay.
It was just through the cable itself.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, sort of a funny story about the being in charge of this. The first colonel we had, he was pretty tough, pretty hard to deal with, pretty straight arrow. And one day these sergeants tell me that this must have been, I got there in '64. This is '65 sometime. It was time for to make the annual trip to the cable factory in Tampa. So what are you talking about? So, Lieutenant, every year we go over to Tampa, where they make the cable, we take a bus and everything, and after it's over, we go to the 99-cent lunch place, have lunch, we go to Busch Gardens, free beer. I thought, yeah, right, sure, you're your dreams. They said, no, we swear. I said, you better not be joking. So I asked the colonel about this. Oh, yeah, we do that. You got to be kidding, okay. So we cut orders and rounded up a bus, and, one person's a designated driver, and you can't have a beer. And we go over there, 2-hour tour of the factory, and went and had lunch and had a beer and came home. But I always thought that was funny because I just thought, you got to be kidding me. And nope. And it was interesting to see how they made all that cable, and we bought a lot of cable, I'll tell you. Another strange story talking about that cable, we had a cable yard. And this cable's on huge reels, I don't know, 7-8 foot high reels, and as far as there's cable. So the sergeants, they're counting cable reels, once a week, and everything's there. And one day they need a cable reel all the way in the back, so they have to move all this. There's no cable on the cable reel. Somebody had climbed over the fence, pulled the cable through the chain link fence or under it, and stole the cable. And stole a lot of cable. They wanted the copper. Melt the lead down, stole the copper. I mean, you never in your wildest dreams would imagine that somebody would do that. And one of the guys lived in the BOQ with us was an OSI agent, Air Force, and he said, yeah, he said, we think we found your cable in the back of a car that could barely move, but the lead sheath was gone, just copper. We couldn't prove it was yours, but we think it was. And it just never ceased to amaze me what people would do. And obviously, there were things that I never thought of. One of the other interesting assignments that I had at that point was being the Air National Guard coordinating officer. GIEA had a number of Air National Guard squadrons, and every year that I was there, the 3 years, we had a National Guard outfit come and spend 2 weeks with us. And that was a major undertaking to integrate them with our operations. You wanted to give them something productive to do, but they're only there for 2 weeks, so it was a challenge. I had a staff sergeant working for me on that project. And thanks to him working with me on that, it helped to get him promoted. He's been somebody who's sort of overlooked, and on the first project we worked with, I guess it was 65, we got a letter of commendation, both of us, from the Tennessee National Guard, and that helped to get him promoted to tech sergeant. And for 2 more years we did it, and it was interesting. I mean, those were nice people that came. I never forget the Tennessee Guard. Some guy was out there digging a ditch for us, and he got a telegram saying he'd been elected to the board of directors of some bank in Chattanooga or something. And these people were hard workers, never complained, and The other job I had was Squadron Information Officer, which was a fancy name for, I guess, being the PR guy. Write stories and get good publicity. And RCA had photographers there, and they had speed graphics cameras with individual plates that you took pictures on. And they took 8x10 glossy pictures it's unbelievable. And it's hard to get bad publicity. I mean, my one friend was the ground safety officer. He never had a good day doing that because you can't win. For being a PR guy, you know, the colonel was thrilled. You know, we get free publicity. One of the other interesting things that happened, I guess 65, 66, I was home on vacation for the summer, and some Pan Am engineer came by our squadron, wanted something. And they said, oh, you need to talk to Lieutenant Thomas. He's home on vacation in Ohio. And this guy said, I think I know him. So when I came back, they gave me his card. It was a guy, he'd gone to the same college I had gone to, but he was really someone my father knew in the steel mill. He was older than me. He'd come from Greece and worked full-time in the mill, went full-time. And I knew him in passing. And he graduated '61, went to New York with Western Union, and my father never heard any more from him. We ran into each other on the Cape and became friends, and you know, it's just a small world. Had he not come into that office, might have never met each other. Because there's 10,000 people on that facility, and the chances of meeting someone, you're just unusual. One of the other really challenging assignments that we had was in January of 1966. Normally, the people that went downrange were enlisted people. We would send a sergeant, a bunch of airmen. At any given time, probably a third of the squadron was downrange. Now and then an officer went if it was a really big project. And in '66, we had a really big project on Ascension Island. Ascension Island, if you look where South America juts out into the ocean, if you were to go due east of there for 1,500 miles and go straight down, you'd land on Ascension. It's a rock, 5x7, a volcano that blew up to became an island. They sent the astronauts there because they said, we think the moon will look like Ascension. It was just red volcanic dust. There's nothing there. Oddly enough, there was a mountain, 2,500 feet high, and they called it Green Mountain because it was up high enough the clouds would form around it, and it got some rain, and so grass and trees would grow up there. The rest of the island was just nothing. It was a British possession. They'd been there since probably the 1700s. Cable and wireless had been there since 1880 probably. It was a relay point to South America and South Africa for the submarine cables. In World War II, the Army Air Corps built an airfield there. For the North African campaign, they flew bombers to South America, Recife, and then flew across, refueled at Ascension. And when the Eastern Test Range opened, Ascension became the last island in the tracking range. So the Brits were there. They had a little town called Georgetown, and they were there to support, I guess, cable and wireless and whatever British interests were. There were no native people there. The Brits typically hired people from St. Helena, which was about 700 miles southeast. They exiled Napoleon there. It was another charming place. Better than Ascension, though. So the Saints typically came and worked, and so that's where we went. And what we were doing was there was a huge transmitter site. You have to remember there was no telephone type communication, satellite. Everything that went uprange went via high frequency shortwave radio. So there was these huge 50,000 watt transmitters, huge antenna fields, and they'd built a bigger and better transmitter building, and we had to move all the stuff from one building, tons of it, to the other building. So it was a major project. And we had to move equipment and all this other type stuff. But first, let me tell you how we got to Ascension. Because when I hear people today complaining about airline travel and whining and complaining, to get to Ascension, you went on a C-130 cargo plane. They build those things up at Dobbins here. And cargo means there's cargo. And so you sat in web seats on the side of the plane for 8 hours looking at cargo. And they gave you earplugs to put in. There's no windows. That's noisy. There's a porta potty with a shower curtain. It's dark. And it's going to be a long 3 days. Typically the first day you stop at Antigua and you sleep in a Quonset hut. Well, that's better than being on the plane. Next you go to Recife, and there you could sleep in a hotel. And then the third day to Ascension, well, you're happy to be there. I mean, this is a godforsaken place, but this beats being on the airplane. When we went, it was myself, we had a tech sergeant, staff sergeant, probably 10 airmen, half electronics, half outside plant. And actually, we were unfortunate in that when we got to Recife, they took us off, fed us, and said, oh, we have a crew that wants to go, so you're going to fly all night. So we didn't go to bed. We just climbed back on and just sat there, and at like 5 in the morning, we roll into Ascension and get off the plane, and all I want to do is, we're in civilian clothes also. People in South America, they didn't want a military presence, so you went in civilian clothes. So we get off the plane, and I'm tired, you know, and all I want to do is sleep. And on Ascension, the Air Force had a major whose job was to represent the Air Force. Everything else was Pan Am, and his counterpart was a Pan Am manager who was the major had a tech sergeant. And I see this major come, and the staff sergeant's the biggest guy. He goes over and he's talking to him, and one thing or another, and the tech sergeant's pointing at me, and the major's shaking his head. Finally, the major comes over and he says, you're Lieutenant Thomas? Yes, sir. You sure you're Lieutenant Thomas? Yes, sir. He just kept, and he kept shaking his head. And finally, he decided I was Lieutenant Thomas. And I said, no, is there a problem, sir? He said, well, he says, in the past, when your people have come here, he says, from time to time, they have been less than respectful of things. He said, we've had some problems with, you know, a little too much drinking and carrying on. And then once he got wound up, I mean, he was, you know, and now that I was there, an officer, he expected good behavior, you know, oh, no, yes, sir, yes, sir. Oh, you know, very sympathetic. Oh, sorry that happened, sir, and won't happen. And so he leaves, and the tech sergeant comes over, and I said, Sergeant, you're going to be shocked at what I'm going to tell you. So that major told me that sometimes you guys don't behave when you're here. Now, I was shocked. I said, I know you're shocked. I said, I assured the man, you know, that nothing bad would happen while I was here. And I said, I want you to tell the men that, you know, that I've given my word. If something bad happens, it's going to happen to all of us. We're going to share the misery. And so we got along okay. They understood. I don't know what they had done before, but, you know, they weren't going to do while I was there.
What was there to do?
Well, you drink. So that was the problem, you know. Drink too much, and, you know, just raise hell. I don't, you know, they find something. The example of this, a couple days go by, and I just crawled into bed, and the staff sergeant wakes me up, and he's telling me that Airman Jones has fallen off the mountain and they can't find him. So what the hell are you talking about? And it makes no sense, and the tech sergeant comes in and he says, that's all right, go back to bed. I said, the man didn't fall off the mountain? He said, he's okay. What do you mean he had been out drinking and apparently socializing with some of the Brits or somebody. He didn't go into town, he found somewhere to go. It's dark, he trips, he falls on the ash, he gets banged up. They cart him to the Pan Am physician who puts mercurochrome on him, sends him back, and says he's fine, and okay. So I hid from the major for a few days, but he found me, and he wanted to talk about this. He didn't know, but he'd heard, and I assured him it was a dark night, and the man stumbled, you know. And okay, he cut me some slack on that. But basically, there was nothing to do there, but we worked 6 days a week. And typically what we would do is, had a civilian engineer, he had the plan. His job, and we all knew each other, they knew the engineer, was to see that things got done, technically speaking. My job was to see overall that the task got done, to deal with the people problems, one thing or another. And so we all worked well together, and they'd go and, 8 in the morning, we'd get up. Some of the best food I've ever had in my life I had on Ascension Island. Pan Am hired some of the best cooks. There was nothing to do. If you couldn't have eaten something, they'd have gone crazy. And they'd go down and start working. At about 10, I'd go down, check on things, and they'd come back, we'd have lunch, and if we needed something, I'd get on the phone and whatever needed doing. And there was nothing to do. We worked Saturdays because I figured, idle hands are the devil's tools, so okay. We took Sunday off, and one of the first things I did when I got there was found out what could you do and not do on that island. Well, don't go near the British town. That was off limits. unless you had a dental problem. They had a dentist, believe it or not, on Ascension, and a physician, but Pan Am had a physician. And there was a place that you could go swimming, approved, okay, so. This was really sad. I mean, this was totally unexpected. On a Sunday morning, I was in that little office we had, and some enlisted guys came to get a truck. They were going to go swimming, okay. So a half hour, 40 minutes later, there's all this commotion, and I hear people saying somebody had drowned. So I thought, well, I'm going to go find out. You know, our guys are helping. Turned out one of our guys had drowned in a swimming accident. One of the airmen got caught in a riptide. He tried to rescue him. The first man got in. He drowned. They couldn't get to him. They got the body, couldn't resuscitate him. He was probably 25, had a wife, 2 children. And I mean, this was the era of Vietnam. You expect in a combat zone, but there, I mean, it just caught everybody off guard. And so suddenly there's stuff they never explained to me in officer school. And the major, he wasn't quite sure what to do. And the sergeant was figuring out how to process the paperwork. Interestingly enough, that morning a cargo plane had landed going back to Florida, so we had a plane. Pan Am had coffins there, so I guess they figured people could die down there, and we had a pan. But it was a British possession, so there were we had to make sure, are we doing the right thing here, legally speaking? And what the hassle began late in the afternoon was, did you need an escort for the body? I thought we did, if for no other reason than we lose the body, we're gonna be in big trouble. And on that range, sometimes things got offloaded, and at that point, even the air crew everybody had an opinion nobody knew. Our colonel at Patrick, it's Sunday, he's trying to find out. Everybody's trying to do the right thing, nobody knows. So finally, when the plane's ready to leave about 10 or 11 at night, I just picked the airmen we thought we could spare and told them, you're an escort. Yeah, just wrote some orders on tablet paper. I said, this probably legally means nothing, but take you off the hook. So we put them on the plane, and the plane leaves. And of course, the plane's no more gone than the colonel calls me from Patrick and says, you don't need an escort till the body gets to the States. I said, well, Colonel, I made a decision. And well, tell a plane to turn around and come back. I thought, I don't think that's going to happen, Colonel, but okay. So by that point, RCA communications people, we were all friends. I ring them up and they say, oh yeah, we can get you the plane. Okay. So I get the airplane commander and I explained to him, we wanted him to come back and drop our fellow off. He didn't have to go. And the commander said, we'll drop him in Recife. I thought, he ain't coming back. So I called the colonel, and what's he going to do, Well, the thing was, when this kid gets to Recife, we had to give him money. He didn't have any money. The sergeant and I had spent all his money. So we had to give him money so he could feed himself. So he's stranded in Recife for 3 or 4 days, waiting for a plane to come to take him back, and orders to come back. He had no orders to come back. And so, I mean, it was just, it was a tragedy, and who knew? But at the end of the day, we did the right thing, I think, and it worked out. And I later wrote that airman up for a life-saving medal, which he did receive. And something for the family, I guess, the fact that he had died trying to save someone. And after that, we just went back, things settled down, we went back to working, and it just, one day leads to another, and you just keep working.
How long were you there?
I was there about 6 weeks, and then another lieutenant came down to replace me, and I think some of the enlisted guys came back, some of them stayed for like 3 months. But some of them were happy to be there in the sense that if you were a young airman at Patrick and didn't have a car, you were kind of stranded. And a lot of them figured they'd just as soon be on Ascension getting TDY money and getting food, and they were no worse off in their minds. So some of them, they were just as soon be there as anywhere. I did meet a Navy lieutenant, interestingly enough. He worked for Budox. He had a civil engineering master's degree from Stanford, and he was spending his whole 4-year tour working on the range, supervising construction work for NASA, of all things. And they were building some big tracking antennas there, and he was monitoring that. So we became friends, and he knew the island, and on Sunday we'd go sightseeing, what there was to see. And at least I had somebody my own age, something in common with. And But basically, I mean, it was just there. There were some guys that were ham radio operators there, and one of them, interestingly enough, my father got into ham radio after I did. He had talked to some guy on Ascension while I was down here, and this RCA guy said, "I talked to your father." I said, "Well, tell him I said hello," you know. And one of the other interesting things, the chief engineer for RCA, he was a ham guy, and the sergeant he came one day, he said, that RCA guy, he wants us to put a telephone pole in the ground next to it. They lived in what would look like motel rooms side by side, better than what we had. But and I said, well, let's go talk to him. I knew we'd do it, but you know, I went and told him I was a ham guy, and what do you want? And, well, we could do you, because I thought we got to get along with this guy. And I told the sergeant, just be careful, don't drop anything. So, you know, you just had to work with people down there. And it was interesting. One time, Pan-Am on a Sunday, we went deep sea fishing. They had a boat, a steel-hulled 45-foot boat. We went out deep sea. But there was not much to do. At night, when it got dark, they would put up a little movie screen, and we'd sit in lawn chairs and look at old 1930s British film, approved by the British Board of Censors. The worst movies you have ever seen, you know. But the food was fantastic. The food was fantastic. When I came back to Patrick in 66, Colonel had left, the Major had left, we had a new Colonel, I don't know, things had changed. So I became the operations officer at that point, which meant I had the electronics and all the other types of stuff. There was a lot of electronics equipment on the Cape, missile intercom equipment all over the Cape. Public address systems, there was no wireless anything in those days, so huge public address systems all over those complexes. We had our own shops where we did repair work of electronic equipment. One of the things that happened in '66, I remember, was we had a fire in a manhole. It was an accident. It happens the way most accidents happen. Some civilian contractors were doing something they shouldn't have done, and something like 28 of these huge cables were destroyed or damaged. You can only put 2 people in a manhole at a time. And these sergeants figured out ways that they could go to the other manholes, free up slack, and somehow patch service back together. And so we worked people 24/7 for several weeks to restore that. And people never complained. People just did what needed to. And I was fortunate. I had very good people working for me. The civilians, the military people. And I was just very, very impressed with what I saw. I mentioned that staff sergeant that had worked with me on the National Guard. And he eventually, in 3 years, working with me on the Guard and some other stuff, went from staff to tech, and just before I left, he became a master sergeant. So he was thrilled. One civilian that worked for me, I think it was second year I was there, 66, he said, Lieutenant, he said, are you happy with the job I'm doing for you? I said, sure, yeah. He said, would you put me in, and he named Sustained Superior Performance Award. I said, what's that? He said, you can get me like $1,000 or $2,000. Really? Yeah, okay. So I go down to base personnel and read up all this, and I thought, you just got, whatever they tell you, that's what you got to do. And then he said, there's 2 other people. Okay. So I write up 3 of them, all this paperwork. And I knew the way these people think. I just made sure I had it done. Sure enough, it got them all $1,000 or $2,000. Oh, they were thrilled. But they deserved it. They had done a good job. But there were other situations which weren't always as happy. There was and you remember the personnel problems, I guess. When I first got there, this is kind of funny, and it wasn't. You know, I looked young in those days. And one of the first things the colonel wanted me to do was to counsel this master sergeant. Married, had a wife, and he seemed to be involved with some waitress from the NCO club, and his wife had talked to the colonel, and the colonel wasn't happy. So I call this master sergeant in, and here's this man, he looks like he'd be my father, and I could be his son, and I'm counseling him. And I'm not, we can overlook the morality of this for the moment. I said, you're going to be losing stripes if you don't straighten up and do stuff different. Well, he did the right thing. He volunteered to go overseas. He got away from both women and straightened them out, I guess. But there was another one where where the sergeants came in, and they said they had really worked hard to get this airman first made a staff sergeant. And he wasn't working out, and they were afraid they were going to have to recommend demoting him and that. And so they said, would you talk to him? I said, sure. So I called him in, and he was African-American, and they were white. And so I thought, well, you know, they had everything that could make him get promoted, and they're not trying to demote him for no reason. And talk to the man. I could tell he truly didn't want to be a staff sergeant. It was too much responsibility. So I said, well, if you keep going the way you're going, you'll get your wish. And so they did, you know. I guess some of the other funny things with people problems that you think about, and these, you know, we had 150 people, and so the people problems were minor part, but you remember them because they were the exceptions to most people don't get in trouble. We had a kid that we were kicking out of the Air Force. Now, I guess he'd been drunk. Who knows? So the admin officer, he tries to get the you have to give him a physical. You just can't kick him out. He's got to have a physical. And the Air Police, because we were a tenant organization, they wouldn't get him out of the Titusville jail. So we had to get him. So first it's one construction sergeant, and then it's two construction sergeants, and then the colonel tells me he wants to go because he hears the man is dangerous. Okay, so I go to these sergeants, big guys. I said, how dangerous is this fella? They said, no offense, Lieutenant, he's about your size, so we could sit on him. So I go back to the colonel. He wanted me to take a gun. I said, a gun? Are you crazy, Colonel? You could talk to the colonel politely. I said, we can manage the boy. We went to the Titusville, Florida jail. Let me tell you, even these two sergeants, they had German police dogs in that jail. That was the scariest place I'd ever been. We got him out of jail, carted him through, you know, and end of the day, they took him back. I said, Colonel, that boy, he ain't going anywhere. It was just... And some other strange things that I was thinking about and reminiscing. At some point, they got the brainstorm, we should have shots, immunization to go anywhere in the world. And in true military thinking, they line us up in front of the base theater in the summer, early in the morning, officers first, and you're going to get every shot you need to be up to date. Well, that meant I got 5, 6 shots. We're talking plague, bubonic plague, typhus, typhoid. Everybody gets shots. Well, guess what? The next morning, 2/3 of the enlisted guys are at sick call, where there's 2 Air Force captain doctors who are used to handling dependents and a couple of sick people. And there's a line down the block, you know. So I guess the hospital commander comes and they figure out they're here because they got all these shots. And I was too sick to go. I just called the colonel and stayed home. He said, that's fine. And, you know, the guys that were TDY, when they came back, they got shots a couple at a time. The problem was every month or two you had to get booster shots, and those shots hurt. And every time I turned around, I'm getting a shot for something. And I'm not going anywhere. And you did not want to lose the shot record because you started all over again. Like I said, most of the people did just outstanding work. They were conscientious, they were hardworking. Typically the ones that got into trouble were young airmen. They're not used to being away from home. And it was just minor things, you know, typically alcohol and misbehaving. And during 1966, it was the year before I got out, you know, it was good duty, let's face it. I'm living in the BOQ across from the Atlantic Ocean. I got a sports car, a little red Triumph, 9 to 5, well actually 7 to 4. You know, it's a good life, but every week in the base newspaper you read about Vietnam. You knew it could happen to you. I had a friend who was a fighter pilot who went. We had a major who went. And so you know, you never lost sight of the fact that there was a war going on. And I was fortunate to be where I was, but I knew that could change. My roommate, who was one of the other lieutenants, he ended up taking a bunch of guys to the Mahi Island and the Seychelles and the Indian Ocean for some project. You know, people just suddenly were gone. 67 would have been my last year in the Air Force. That was the year of the Apollo fire where the 3 astronauts died. people don't realize that happened on Cape Canaveral. They were at a launch complex on the Cape, not on the NASA facility. And I remember that because it was a Friday night in January, and usually went to the officers club for happy hour around 6, and for some reason I was late, 6:45. And I see all these people bailing out of the officers club. The general and the 2-star ran the range and got in, and we found something bad had happened. But by and large, a lot of those things we weren't involved with. I mean, you were just on the periphery of it. So you knew it happened and aware of it, and it was a tragedy. But, you know, we were dealing in infrastructure, telecommunications, and we weren't directly involved in launch operations and what have you. In the spring of '67, I got promoted, much to my amazement, to captain. When I first went in the Air Force, it took 3 years to make first lieutenant, 5 to make captain, and then they lowered it to 18 months. And that 18 months, I had enough money, that's where I got the sports car. The captain thing came from nowhere. That surprised me. I kind of liked being a first lieutenant. My friend who'd been a Signal Corps guy in World War II gave me a sterling silver bar that he had worn in World War II, and I wore it. And so I really didn't even want to be a captain, but they assured me I had to be a captain. Okay. The spring of '67, I also put in to leave the Air Force because 4 years was up in the fall, and I wasn't staying in. And I was frozen to the base after that. And so I applied in the fall to leave. And so the '67, it was kind of winding down and leaving. And when '67 rolled around, I left, you know, processed out. And one last thing, I guess, that I thought was military whatever. A couple months before I'm going to get out, I was talking with one of the base finance officers who lives in the BOQ with us, and mentioned I had like 60 days worth of leave, and I'm getting a lot of money, and be a big check. And he said, "Oh no, you'll be getting cash." I said, "You're kidding me." "Oh no, you should have asked for a check months ago." I said, "You're joking." "Oh no, it's too late now." So sure enough, the morning I processed out, I think in $20 bills, I got $1,000. I had a grocery bag filled with money. There's no place to go with this. I just, you know, I drove up, finally got to Daytona and found a bank open and got a cashier's check and sent it to my bank in Texas. And I just laughed. I thought, oh well. When I got out, I went to work for the telephone company up in Washington, D.C. And I worked in '69, would have been June. I had 6 years worth of military service. And so I called the Pentagon and said, I want to resign my commission. That was the only way I could be released from active duty. Otherwise, I stayed in the reserves, inactive forever, and could be recalled. And that happened to people in Korea who got recalled because they held commissions from World War II. And I thought, nah, I don't want to do that. So the sergeant tells me, and I send him a letter, and okay, they send me 2 discharges. And I thought, why am I getting 2 discharges? You know, and I look. One of them was a discharge from the regular Air Force where I had been a staff sergeant for pay purposes, which I thought was funny. The second one was a discharge as a permanent first lieutenant in the Air Force Reserves or something. So, okay. So I sent him to my father, who took him to the county courthouse and registered. Thought, I can always prove I'm a civilian, you know. And so I basically finished. I had the GI Bill. I had taken a correspondence course. I took a lot of correspondence courses in the Air Force. I took one on communications engineering from the Cleveland Institute of Electronics, great course on the GI Bill, but I still had GI Bill money. I was flying at that time rented a plane at Dulles Airport, which had no flying activity at the time. Hard to believe now, but. And these people wanted me to start working on a commercial rating because I could use the GI Bill money, and I didn't want to do that. And these guys I was working with said, you want a color TV set? And I said, well, I guess. They said, well, you could take on a GI Bill a color TV repair course. You can get a color TV. Oh, okay. So I signed up for this course, and it was a good course. They sent me a Heathkit color TV set to build. Every week or two, I got parts of that course. It took months, finally built it, and I thought, oh, okay. I learned some stuff, but you know, by and large, the people I knew in the military, I lost touch with. One of them was stationed in Washington, on and off. We kept up with each other. A lot of the others just drifted away. I stayed in Washington for about 5 years. 72, I left. Went to work for Litton Industries in Beverly Hills. They ran a large internal telecommunications network for the company, and I was involved with that. In 74, I went to Cleveland, Ohio to handle telecommunications for a company that eventually moved us to Chicago. Then in 1980, I came to Atlanta, worked for a bank for a couple of years here in telecommunications, and then worked for the state of Georgia for 20 years. The state, at that time, had a very large private network all over the state. Voice communications. At one point in the 90s, the state had the largest distance learning and telemedicine network in the world. And they had lasted about 10 years. Very large operation. We had a statewide paging system. The state was doing a lot of very innovative things with telecommunications. In about, I guess it was 2007, I'd worked for the state about 20 years, and so I was ready to retire. And between the state and Social Security, retired, and the Social Security people said, "Did you serve in the military?" "Oh, yeah." So they said, "We'll get back to you." So they got back and they said, "Well, you're going to get more money because you served in the military." I said, "Well, how much?" They said, "Well, you'll be getting $1 a month more, Social Security." I said, "You're joking." No. Okay, why not? Most of the people I knew, I lost touch with over the years. There's still one fellow who was a crop duster in Liberal, Kansas. For whatever reason, he and I have kept up with each other. This summer, he was at a high school reunion in Virginia, and he drove down to spend the day with me. And the others have just drift away. You don't know what happens. They're gone, drift away. I've Googled some up. Some are alive and well. Some have died, passed on, and some you can't find. And to me, the military, I wasn't dying to serve in the military, but it was a good experience. I think for me, it was the right thing at the right time, the right place. The education technically that I received was outstanding. The people interactions I received was outstanding. And it was a very good experience. People today are sort of surprised I was in the military, let alone a line officer, let alone running a construction outfit. I said, yeah. I said, I just...
Well, let me ask you a question
Yes.
about your career pattern. I mean, as you go into the Air Force, you have a pilot's license.
Civilian, private.
Civilian, understand,
Right.
but I mean, you understand the principles of flight and
Right.
all those other things. And you end up as an electronics person. Was that based on the aptitudes in the tests?
Oh, I couldn't have passed the flying physical. You had to have 20/20 vision. I could hardly see the big letter E without glasses. They'd have just laughed at me, forget that. And who knows, like I say, electronics school, the Air Force would have loved to have had engineers. But the reality is less than 10% of people in the United States get science, technical engineering.
Right.
So the Air Force took liberal arts graduates, figuring, do you know how to read, write, and think? And if you pay attention, we can teach you to do this. And they did. So people just learned how to do it. And electronics was fine. I liked it. Some of these other people were kind of surprised to be in electronics school. Most of them, did okay. Some of them had to study a little harder than others. As far as I know, most people graduated. You just buckled down and did what you had to do. And there were people who ended up as aircraft maintenance officers and other kinds of things. And our admin officer hated being admin, and somehow he convinced the colonel to let him go. And he got into air traffic control school and spent a couple years at Edwards and got out and had gotten a commercial pilot's license. He never flew for the military, but went to some 6-week crop duster school, became a crop duster, and 18,000 hours later, he's still spraying crops. And, telecommunications, from the phone company went into what would be called corporate telecommunications, companies, organizations that ran their own large private networks. And it suited me. The phone company, I did engineering work, and I was more suited for corporate telecommunications, although the phone company was a great experience. And interestingly, one of the first things they did was send me to a school out at Lisle, Illinois for a month on computer-controlled telephone systems. And the first week of the school was all computer fundamentals, which I had learned from correspondence courses in the Air Force. So the Air Force training, and then when I worked for the state, I worked with a fellow who had gone to electronics school. He graduated from Emory with a degree in history, probably a couple years after I had graduated, went to electronics school, spent 22 years as an electronics officer, made lieutenant colonel, and actually ended up back teaching at that school. And he had only great things to say about the electronics school. And we had a couple other people that passed through that had been electronics people. And you know, most of the career types got master's degrees, typically in business or something. And so for me, it was great. I mean, I was happy. It was just, you know, worked out, but you know.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and you tell it well. It's very well done. What we do at the very end of the interview is just give our interviewee an opportunity to speak his mind or her mind about any subject, any topic, service, government, whatever. It's Mr. Thomas's editorial time.
Well, like I say, I think the military, for me, was a good experience. I think I learned a lot. I think to this day, a lot of what I learned in the military is still useful to me and understanding. And I understand in Vietnam that was a tough time, and for particularly people that went there and the ground troops and that was a tough war. It was a tough war for people that got shot down in combat and one thing or another. But yet, I'm respectful of people who were against the war. I met a woman on the bus, interestingly enough, a nurse. And during the years that I served in the military, she was a nurse in New York, and she was helping to counsel people about how to avoid the draft, how to avoid Vietnam. And when she told me about that, she thought that I would be offended. And I said, no. I said, you did what you believed in, and I said, I can respect that. I said, so I don't have a problem with that. So I have a lot of respect for people who did what they thought was the right thing. And of course, I did what I thought was the right thing. And, you know, looking back, it's hard now for a lot of people to appreciate what it was like in that era. And I know that timing's everything. I was fortunate. I went in '63 before the war geared up. We had a first lieutenant instructor in electronics school. He'd graduated from the West Point. In those days, you could graduate from one service academy and ask for commission in the other branch of service if they take you. When Vietnam geared up, they stopped that, but he asked to come in the Air Force. Some West Pointers did it because they wanted to fly. He said he did it because he didn't want to go to Vietnam. And he said, these Army guys, that's where they wanted to go. He said he would just different orientation. He wanted to be in the Air Force. So, you know, I just have a lot of respect for people who did what they thought was the right thing. I can respect that, you know. And you have to live with decisions. And that was one thing. I talked about learning to fly an airplane. The guy that taught me had been a P-51 pilot in Europe in World War II. And I think learning to fly a plane was a character-building experience. And that I remember when I soloed an airplane for the first time. 19, you think you'll live forever. And I remember looking down, saying to myself, he's down there and I'm up here, and if I can't do this, I'm going to die. And I remember thinking, oh, you can do this. Let's think happy thoughts here, you know. And you did it. But he explained that, you know, given half a chance, this plane will kill you. This is not a car with wings. And so you learn to be responsible. You run it out of fuel, and you think you've been lost in a car. You haven't lived till you've been lost in an airplane, and you're going 110 miles an hour, and the map and the ground have nothing to say to each other. And the first impulse is not to panic because you're up here all alone. And so I always felt like I learned a lot from that, you know, in working in the broadcasting industry. If you don't show up at work, the guy who's there by himself, he can't go home till you show up. And if you're not paying attention and you're supposed to be recording a program for rebroadcast, so you learn responsibility. And working with adults, as I did, you know, you learn to be a responsible adult. And so I just, you know, just fortunate that, you know, that a lot of times fighter pilots have a saying, it's better to be lucky than smart. And at times, you know, you can work hard, and it's just luck. You're at the right place at the right time, and obviously it helps to be prepared. But so now, you know, like I said, I have no regrets about it. I think I did the thing, and it was a good experience. And but I understand it's changed. You know, the world's it's different, and people have different outlooks and different objectives. But I think I say, for me, it was a good experience.
Great. We appreciate you coming in and telling your story, and we also thank you for your service. It was a really good story, and you told it well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.